Guys, NBA DFS is tough. Sure, pretty much anyone out there nowadays can find a decent set of average projections and an optimizer and spit out a few hundred lineups pretty easily, but that's not enough to win today. When you're trying to beat the best NBA GPPs in 2021, we need to focus on upside. And if you've watched our other videos, you know to get upside in DFS, you need to focus on correlation, ownership, and variance. But for NBA, that's hard. What players are correlated? Is it the same for every game? Is it the same for every outcome of every game? What's the good chalk and the bad chalk? Who has the highest ceilings and how often do they get there? To cap it all off, NBA news breaks so often and with so little time before each game starts. Once you've answered every single one of these questions, if you can even get there, you need to be able to update everything and reanalyze the slate completely every time a new surprise starting lineup comes out. Beating daily fantasy basketball in 2021 is tough, but it's possible. My name is Jordan. I'm joined by Matt and Will today, and in this strategy session, we're going to be talking about how SaberSim solves these problems with the only complete game simulator on the market. Before we really start jumping in here, as always, guys, we are live here for a reason. If you have questions while we're talking through how all this stuff works today, please shout it out into the Office Hours channel in Slack or into YouTube chat, and we will tackle all these questions as we see them, probably a lot of them closer to the end. But let's go ahead and just jump into it. I want to start here. I know that maybe when somebody is a little bit unfamiliar with SaberSim, they pull up the app for the first time, you're going to see a lot of familiar kinds of numbers here, right? We've got projections and we've got ownership projections, and we've even got, kind of percentiles here or floor and ceiling projections. But what's actually powering these numbers or how we're generating these numbers is very different than what people are probably used to on a traditional tool. So Matt, Will, do you guys want to kind of provide a little bit of a background of what we actually mean when we're saying that we are simulating games?
Yeah. So I'll kick it off. So it's similar to the other sports that we've talked about. We've done these videos for MLB and NFL over the past 6 months or however long. Feels like less, but yeah, it's a similar idea where we're simulating games play by play thousands of times, and as the game is simulated, we store the results of every play for every player, and what we end up with is a range of outcomes for every player. So when I say simulator, I really mean simulator. It's essentially like we are playing a video game of the game, automatically over and over and over again. So, for MLB, it is a lot easier because it's like these discrete events where it's like there's the at bat, and then there's the result, and then there's a new state. And for sports, like even for NFL, the play ends and like the clock is stopped, or maybe the clock's running, but like it's kind of discrete plays. Whereas NBA, it's a lot more fluid. But we're still simulating it, and we're essentially doing that by kind of going possession by possession, and we're essentially determining based on our projections for all of the players that are on the court, so not just whoever has the ball, but all of the players on the court, and how much time is on the clock, what the quarter is, what the score differential is, all these different factors. We're coming up with these probabilities for the results of every possession, essentially. So it'll be either a shot attempt or a foul or a turnover or a steal. And then, if it's a shot attempt, then we determine, well, was the shot blocked? Was the shot fouled? Did it go in? Did it miss? If it missed, was it a rebound? And so we kind of have this like decision tree of events. And I think, Will, we were talking earlier, and you had a good analogy of like when you're looking at the ESPN game log and you just see like the plays kind of come up. That's essentially what we're doing, is we're just deciding each play, predicting the outcome of each play. And we're just doing that thousands of times and coming up with this whole range of outcomes for each game through that sim.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so, I mean, kind of one step deeper there, you mentioned that we are looking at the probabilities of all of these different events or the percent of a time maybe that there's a shot attempt versus a turnover, or if somebody, if somebody shoots, do they make it? Is it blocked? All these things. How are those probabilities calculated? How do we kind of start to think about how likely a certain player is to shoot the ball or get an assist or anything like that?
So I'll take that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's basically a combination of a bunch of different factors. So I think one of the biggest improvements that we made was like, considering not only like the player and who's on the court and the opponent and, the score differential at the time, because if a team is losing by like say 10 points in the fourth quarter, they might start shooting more threes because they're trying to catch the game up. So we're basically taking a whole bunch of different, they're almost like historical rates, but they're slightly different than just like the historical average. But, Duncan Robinson, 70% of his shots are threes, but he's on the court with other 3-point shooters. So he might be, down in the post or something like that, or, working a different angle and taking a 2-pointer more frequently. So we're basically combining all of the different inputs that go into an event and sort of combining them into a singular probability to determine what happened.
Gotcha. Awesome.
Yeah, and we're doing that in a smarter way that, like, you kind of alluded to it, Will, but I want to expand on that. This isn't just like, oh, well, let's look at like each player's stats, even like when they're on the court for the past year or the past 2 years. It's similar to how we do other sports. Like, this is a very sophisticated like machine learning model where we're it's based on how many days ago was the game. So a game that happened a year ago is going to be weighted less than a game that happened a week ago, but they're all still going to have these impacts, and all the factors kind of are connected. They're not independent. And so like, yeah, each event is sort of taken in relation to the rest of the factors of the game and of the play. So we're really trying to isolate the impact of each individual player and each individual factor in the outcome of each play. And that leads to just kind of that's really the best way to create these like context neutral projections that go into the sim.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I mean, one thing I'm kind of curious about too, and this really just popped into my head, is we have some kind of very sabermetric factors and things like baseball and football. Maybe it's like the weather or, the park factors or something like that in baseball. Is there anything like that in particular that's maybe, more about the game and environment or anything that comes into play in NBA or less so for a sport like this?
I mean, I think game context plays a pretty big role, time remaining and score differential mostly. Because, like if you're losing by 10 points in the second, you're not changing your game plan that much. But if you're losing by 10 points in crunch time, you probably are going to start changing something up and start, taking more aggressive shots or elevating your pace so that you're sort of, more likely to catch up. So I do think that, yeah, it's not quite as impactful as something like the wind in Wrigley.
Yeah.
But there's definitely impact, and they're definitely valuable factors to be including.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah. So I guess, thinking about these sims, when we've done our NFL and baseball shows on the same topic, one of the things that we start to talk about pretty quickly is that simulating games allows us to very precisely calculate the big correlations between players. And the next step there is when you're building lineups in SaberSim, you start building lineups with stacks without having to set any rules. And we talk a lot about in all of our content for things like baseball about how not normally distributed hitters are, for example, or potentially wide receivers or tight ends or pass catchers in football, right, have a range of outcomes that isn't modeled well with a normal distribution, right? These are things that come up in these other sports. For NBA, I'll pull this back up on the screen again here. I know if you click some of these players' ranges of outcomes, we don't have a exact normal distribution on the outcomes for players, but it does look a little bit more like a bell curve. And a lot of these correlation factors between players are quite a bit smaller than we've seen in other sports. What are the primary advantages that we have here, as somebody using SaberSim to build my lineups every night? I I know that the simulations are powering this, but what am I getting out of this? What improves in my lineups compared to, a traditional tool that maybe is just going to take an average projection and just model a distribution like a perfect bell curve or something like that?
Yeah, so I think really the biggest thing is like when utilizing sim variants where you're pulling from the actual sims themselves, you get some of like the not just the average correlation of all of their sims, but some of like the more uniquely correlated outcomes, like something like a blowout and then their backup player coming in and getting extra run, where the star player already put up 60 points, so we'll pull them out and we'll put in his backup. So like there's something like that where their overall correlation is low or possibly even negative, but getting some of those game scripts that you otherwise wouldn't, and certainly happen very regularly, I think are pretty significant advantages over just taking like a standard normal distribution approximation for all players.
Gotcha. Yeah. So
yeah, for sure.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to kind of add on to that I really think that the correlation values themselves that you were just pulling up on the app are huge, and something that a lot of other sites don't have. And I don't want to downplay that those are valuable, but
Yeah.
Will's absolutely right that is not enough. A correlation value, I've said this before, that a correlation value is one number that is summarizing the relationship between like thousands of data points.
Mm-hmm.
So you have two players, right, that have thousands of possible outcomes, and the correlation is literally just taking all of those different outcomes and saying this is one number that summarizes how they're related. But obviously it's a lot more complex than just one number, and it's not as simple as like, oh well, they have a 0.1 correlation, so if this player's in the lineup, maybe you should boost the other player by 10%. It's when Jokic has like a 80-point game, how does that affect the rest of his teammates? When he has a 40-point game, how does that affect the rest of the teammates and the opponents? And you can't get that without running sims. And like Will said, the sim variance setting in the builder is really the way to do that. It pulls in the actual sims into the builder, so it's using those kind of unique relationships between the players' ranges of outcomes that aren't incorporated by either the average projection or the correlation values.
Gotcha. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and it's really interesting. I think for something like football, the idea of these game scripts make a lot of intuitive sense to people. If your team's behind, they're going to throw the ball a ton, and maybe your wide receivers stand to catch a few extra passes, or maybe have some additional upside in that particular game script. But it's not something that I would have as intuitively thought of for something like NBA, partly because I think that these game scripts are kind of complicated. Like it doesn't always necessarily mean that, a player's upside goes down. I think one of the common things that you hear is that if a game is going to blow out, right, you don't want to play the stars in that game because then they're not going to get their full minutes load. But, if a game blows out, somebody has to score all those points. And maybe if the Bucks are winning by 30, it's because Giannis went for 40, 15, and 10 or something like that, right? So it's really interesting that this idea of how important context is into determining how likely a player is to have that ceiling game. One of the other things that at least popped into my mind here that at least I wanted to mention and get your guys' thoughts, but one of the very uniquely NBA things is how quickly news changes. How does that play into our process for simulating these games? If we've figured out exactly, I pick a game that's on the slate tonight, so we've got the Wizards and Raptors, and it looks like everybody, at least tonight, wants to play Spencer Dinwiddie. If we found some news that for whatever reason he wasn't going to play, how does that change how we're thinking about that game? What's the process that takes place, and what happens to those game simulations, I guess, when news breaks like that?
Yeah, so first of all, sorry, we have the like kind of minutes projections and usage projections that go into the sim to begin with. And so, if there's news that Dinwiddie isn't going to play, we'll kind of initially just distribute his minutes among the rest of the team in an appropriate manner.
Mhm.
But the key thing that we do that I think kind of differentiates is we're going to assign someone else as a starter, right? And then in the sim, that new player is going to be in on the court with the rest of the starters for the first, however 7-8 minutes of the game, and we're going to still model those same rotations. And I don't know if we didn't really talk about it much so far, but one of the big changes and improvements that we've made this year is that we are actually simulating real rotations that the teams use. And that is really huge in terms of modeling that range of outcomes and those correlated performances. So when there's big news, we're not just adjusting the projections so that the bench players on the team get higher projections and and have higher value. We're actually simulating the relationship between those players and the starters. Their usage is going to change. Their correlation in those high upside games are going to change. So all of that is kind of being incorporated in the sim when that kind of news breaks.
Real quick, I want to add on to that because I think another really cool thing I was excited to add was sort of smarter variance in minutes, which I think especially ties in here with like a late substitution or a new starter that wasn't expected. Is I know last year a lot I got burned when the Mavericks would say that they're going to play Jalen Brunson and then they just decide that they're not going to play Jalen Brunson. And so, we did a lot of work in sort of adding, variance to what the minutes projections are. So it's like, we think he's a starter. We think he's going to go 25 minutes. But, we're looking at, how that team has historically handled, like new starters, like, people that don't normally start and what the variance in that minutes looks like. So, there will be sims that more accurately project when they only play him for 5 minutes or if they play him for the full 35. And so that was one thing that I was really excited and I think adds a lot of good, just good context to the sims.
Gotcha. Yeah, and those game scripts themselves change too, right? If the big star player isn't going to play, maybe the other team's more likely to stay in the game. Maybe they're more likely to blow out. That has a ripple effect of then what the plays in that game, who has the greatest upside, who's going to see the floor, that kind of thing. So all really, really powerful and interesting to hear about some of this stuff. Matt, you had mentioned that we've made some improvements this season and obviously excited to talk about a few of those. But before we really get into that, I'm curious, how do we know when there is something to be improved here? Obviously, everything that we have going in the simulations is very sophisticated and it all sounds great, but clearly always room to improve any model. What does our process look like for figuring out where there's room to improve, figuring out where things maybe even look a little bit off? Curious of what our review process is, I guess.
Yeah, so this offseason, we kind of knew that we needed to do a pretty big, I don't know if overhaul is the right word, but there were a lot of changes that we had made to the sims and the models for other sports that weren't really in place for NBA. And so we knew that just in terms of kind of having more accurate projections, we wanted to rewrite the model in a smarter way that kind of accounted for the relationship between different players on the court and better modeled like the what we call like the decay rate in terms of like how much time matters in terms of like when performance happened. And so that was just sort of based on kind of theoretical, like this is what we know needs to happen just based on kind of the best practices for writing models. And one major thing that we did that really Will spent a lot of time on writing into this new approach to creating projections is that we sort of have backtesting built into the model. So as we're going through the historical data and kind of generating these projections that go into the sim, we're testing those projections against actual data. And so we can see when there are certain stats that we're not projecting well or that are very difficult to project, where there's like a certain factor that suddenly, or maybe not suddenly, but there's a certain factor that might not have a high correlation in terms of like the prediction versus the actual result, we'll be able to see that and kind of make those changes. So that's in terms of just the overall, like the projections that go into the sim, but we're also running tests on the range of outcomes. So, how well are the percentile projections matching the actual percentiles of results? How well are the correlations matching actual correlations? That part is very difficult to do, especially with something like NBA, because there's such small samples and each game is so different in terms of like who are the starters, how many minutes is each player playing. You can't really like look at historical correlation and kind of compare to predicted well, but we're definitely working on testing in terms of measuring that well. But yeah, really, it's like a lot of it, I think, similar to NBA, to NFL, has been improving those game scripts. And, Will's put a lot of work into modeling, kind of really digging into like these detailed logs of like running the sim, logging out every play, and looking at like how is the game progressing? Is that matching what actually would happen in a real game? And getting those game scripts right is so crucial, I think, to getting the ranges of outcomes and the simulations and the correlations correct. And that's going to like have an impact on all aspects of the site, from mean projections to to those sim variance values. So that's sort of the overall approach. Obviously, there's like a lot of different things that we try to do there, but that's kind of how we've tackled this off season. I don't know if you have anything else to add there, Will.
Yeah, so that's the bulk of like how we do backtesting now. I think the biggest thing is definitely like with the new way that we generate the rates, being able to see, our exact, there's a few different metrics that we use to analyze it, but essentially seeing how accurate we are at predicting whether when there's a scoring play that there was an assist on it. So it's like we were able to see how good our model is at, given the same inputs that it would have in the sim, sort of what outcome we come up with and how close is that to predicting reality. And so that's, been a really crucial part. And I think we do a great job as far as getting like the accuracy good on those stats. So yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I know when we were talking about NFL, there's sometimes a little bit of a process from, originally seeing that maybe something's wrong to actually finding what the culprit is in the actual model. And sometimes those things aren't as related as they might have initially appeared. I know for NFL, we had talked, I can't remember what the initial red flag was. Maybe it was passing touchdowns or something like that, but ended up leading us towards a big investment towards modeling timeouts. Is there anything like that in NBA, or can you talk a little bit about what the process looks like from, maybe discovering an initial thing that could use some improvement to actually finding what the thing is to be improved or what can be modeled better?
Yeah, so I think it was a little different this time in the fact that we sort of rebuilt the sim around the new projection system. And so utilizing that, it was less about, having a red flag and then finding it. It was more about, we've now built this new version of the sim, but it's doing something really weird. And so then it's just, digging into sort of where those stats are generated. And I think there was especially like adding, basically just sectioning out every little thing made it a lot easier to sort of go through and find where those bugs are and fix them. And I think that, it honestly went pretty smoothly, all things considered. So yeah.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah. And we've touched on it a little bit of just how big of an update there has been this season, but is there any, specific kind of flagship changes that have been made that you really want to highlight that really add a lot of value for users this year?
Yeah, so my favorite thing is sort of twofold. It's initially it's incorporating sort of when you have the shooting player, including like their teammates as a factor, as an input of if they're going to take the shot or not, because like if it's LeBron James and he's playing with four of like the second rotation, and he's probably more likely to take a shot than if he's playing on the court with Anthony Davis and Russell Westbrook, who also take a lot of shots. So I think adding that context is really cool, and it ties in directly with the rotational model, which is, one of the things I've been working a lot on that I'm just really excited about, because it's really cool about how and when we sub in players and why, and doing that in a smart way not only improves like their correlations just from having them on the court more, but improves the accuracy of like the simulations themselves, because the more accurate your teammates and opponents are that are on the court, the more they're impacting the projected rates, and the more that changes the outcomes in the sim. So.
Gotcha. Cool. So, I mean, am I understanding this correctly that, we're really individually thinking about the 10 basketball players on the court, less so? I guess my point, or what I'm trying to ask here is, if players have switched teams, or teams are even just running new rotations, or have rookies this year, we're a little bit maybe well equipped to deal with that, just because we know like what these individual players actually look like and how they play. We're not so much relying on historical team data. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. There's obviously still things like, when you have a player on a new team, their usage is just going to be different, because they're in a new system and a coach is going to use them a new way. And so like we do our best to account for that by looking at things like props and Vegas totals that might sort of lead into how we can adjust those. But yeah, I think we do a really good job of isolating, Russell Westbrook is a very pass-heavy point guard, and De'Aaron Fox is not a very pass-heavy point guard. And so if you're on the court with Russell Westbrook and you make a shot, you're more likely to have got there's more likely to have been an assist than if you're on the court with De'Aaron Fox. And that's obviously like an isolated example, and there's more factors that go into it. But that's sort of the gist of it, is figuring out how these players play, which, does change. And that's a big part of why we, factor in decay, and why we're like weighting more recent games like more heavily than, older games. But yeah, I think we basically isolate who the players are and how they affect the other things going on the court.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, it's really cool. So, I mean, if there's a guy that normally plays with the second unit and gets a ton of shots up with the second unit, is thrown to the starting lineup tonight, we'll kind of understand that maybe he's not going to get as many shots up with all the high usage players that play in the starting lineup.
Exactly.
Is that the right way? Awesome. Yeah. So I guess the one thing that jumps into my mind then is that obviously the model itself is very well prepared for breaking news and things that kind of come out and totally change the way people are thinking about the slate, or the way a team's going to play. But obviously this news breaks quickly, and you need to react quickly, and to react quickly, the Sims need to react quickly. Have we done any work this year on making sure that those updates happen quickly, or any speed improvements that we've made this year in a sport where that is super crucial?
Yeah, I think it's a twofold there. So on sort of my end of stuff, yeah, we made a pretty big speed, we made a pretty big speed improvement to the sim, and basically, stripping it down, making it run accurately, but as quickly as possible. So that was a big emphasis where I spent a lot of time sort of like, how can I optimize this happen? Like when this event happens, it's adding, a couple seconds to the overall time of all the sims. How can I narrow that down? So it's definitely a focus, and I think that we're in a really good place speed-wise. And then Matt, if you want to touch on, basically how quickly we're able to react to news now, I think that's also a huge.
Yeah. So I mean, we're reacting very quickly to news. I think that'll only improve as we get through these first few weeks as well. There's kind of Will and I are both working on more improvements in terms of like how quick we're reacting and how quick the sims are running. But essentially it's very, very fast. Right now sims are finishing in like 90 seconds. I think we'll get that under 60 pretty soon. And the plan is really to have these sims immediately reacting to news, so that if someone is ruled out, you're going to get updated projections within a minute or two, which is obviously crucial for something like NBA where it can be last minute. So yeah, that's really been a big emphasis, and something that we've made a lot of improvements on, and we're going to continue really focusing on that because of how important it is to get those updated sims as quickly as possible.
Right. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned getting the sims to run even faster, and faster is always better. Is there anything else in the pipeline, or things that we're looking forward to doing, even in future seasons? Just that our work this year has kind of highlighted that could potentially present opportunities for improving the model further in the future.
Yeah, so I mean, Will and I both mentioned the rotations update. Will's still working on some additional improvements there. So we've already implemented a lot of improvements to like how we're modeling rotations, and we'll be pushing out another update probably this week that'll make that even better in terms of being more flexible when there are like starting lineups that have never played together before, which is going to happen a lot. Obviously, at the beginning of the season, we'll be able to kind of model what the rotations might look like, kind of based on how the teams have used sort of different rotations in the past, but sort of take those as like a baseline and adjust based on like the new players. And so that's like a really big thing that I think we're both really excited about, because it'll just make those simulations much more accurate, even if it's like these players that have never played together before. I don't know. Do you have anything else, Will, that you're excited about or have on your mind to improve?
Yeah, so rotations is definitely like the biggest. Like, I honestly think I could probably spend a year continually like adding more and more things to a rotation model, because it's simple on the surface. Because like obviously, if you're a coach, you know who you're going to put in next. But it's definitely like a really fun puzzle to try and solve, like from a data standpoint, because it's like obviously Frank Vogel has not written out a letter and explicit instructions about when he does what, but like there is data in there that can get us some good educated guesses on it. So that's probably like my favorite thing that I'm looking forward to. And like, yeah, we have some cool upcoming improvements. But even in future seasons, I feel like that will be just a really great thing, because it also just has such a large impact on the sim. And then I also think, getting more nuanced interactions between players is something to investigate as well. So minutes variance is good in incorporating like how those variations in minutes change, and then also how, when those minutes are changed, what changes about like who gets the minutes, how the rotations look when they get those minutes, and sort of that can add in a lot of nuanced like game script correlation stuff that I think is just fascinating.
Yeah, and one thing I'm curious about, and maybe this is already in there, but the rotations themselves are the way that we have some minutes variance, and there's different rotations that maybe happen in different game sims for the same game. That's all contextual, and is that dependent on the game script of the sim that is running? So, the backups start coming in when the game reaches a certain score, or
yeah.
Awesome, cool, yeah. So it really does. I mean, that game script principle is really so crucial here. It kind of is the thread that runs through everything almost, I guess.
And I really think that that's where like the edge is in DFS. I mean, average projections are good nowadays. Like there's a lot of data that you can do to come up with a good mean projection for LeBron James, but putting a lineup together around that, I think is really like what can win GPPs. And so that's why it's like the most fascinating thing to me is getting all of those game scripts, dialed in and getting those sims ready. It's really fun.
Yeah, it's not 2015 anymore where you can just play optimal lineups in GPPs and print money. You really have to differentiate with those, ranges of outcomes and the sims and correlations and all of that. So yeah, for sure. Just kind of piggybacking on what Will said, I think that's so crucial in today's game.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one question that we get a lot, and I do see, guys, there are some questions that are coming in here now. I wanted to ask one more question to these guys, and then we'll start jumping into to some of the questions that are coming in chat. But a question I commonly get from users on office hours, and especially people that have watched some of these streams and seen some of our other content, is what am I supposed to do? Especially knowing that all of this stuff is powering your lineups, and that we're thinking about rotations and game script in this such a sophisticated way, and pulling those sims directly with sim variants. And even if we don't have big very visible stacks when you're building lineups, that there's a thought behind the correlation of the lineups, and we're even thinking about the ownership of players, and what is the good chalk or the bad chalk on a slate. How can users continue to kind of maybe add a little bit of value or leave a mark on their particular set of lineups to differentiate the lineups that they're entering versus anybody else that's playing SaberSim or using SaberSim that night to build their lineups?
Yeah, I mean, so to be honest, like we have taken care of a lot of the stuff that you might normally have to do to create good lineups. And like for myself, I do very little with the SaberSim lineups. For so part of that is because I don't have much time. Like I spend like 5 minutes on my lineups and I dump them in. I'm not saying that you can't add value by spending more time on it. But I think a lot of the stuff with like adding a bunch of rules and groups that you don't get players together, and so you're kind of trying to account for correlation is not necessary. I think there's sort of two avenues of value that that I see as kind of ways that you can improve upon the existing base that SaberSim gives you. One is in terms of the projections themselves. I think we do our best to like get those minutes and playing time and projections right, but you know there's a lot of news in terms of like coaches just saying stuff about like, oh, I think I'm going to give this player some run tonight, or like this player is going to be limited, and it's not always clear how to interpret that. So I think one way you can add value is just based on either research or intuition about players that might get more or less playing time, more or less minutes on the court than we think that they will. One example from last night is, some people in chat actually at night were talking about Avery Bradley, who is on the Lakers now and is pretty like low on the depth chart. We didn't give him minutes because he was pretty low on the depth chart. We didn't think he was, the model didn't think that he was going to get run. Some people were saying they thought he would. It got to like the 7th minute of the fourth quarter before he got into the game, but he did end up playing like basically the end of the game. And that's something where, you can maybe add value by seeing like, hey, I think Avery Bradley is going to get more run than this other rookie. I keep forgetting his name. Who was Austin Reeves we had with minutes, and not Avery Bradley. And maybe you kind of do some research into news and you say, I think Bradley's going to get more run. I'm going to up his projection, lower Austin Reeves with Kendrick Nunn out. So that's one little thing that you can do to add value, is kind of do that research. I don't really do stuff like that because I don't have the time. The other thing is risk management, which I do a decent amount of, and that's just kind of looking at your exposure to players relative to their projected ownership, and just kind of trying to manage your risk so that you're not losing your entire entry fees in one night if a player has a bad game. I think with NBA, you do have to be careful with that, because unlike other sports, sometimes you might want to have 100% of a player, and like, yeah, they might get injured, but like if they're going to be 70% owned and you still think that they're a good play, you might want to have a lot of them. So I wouldn't just like set a max exposure cap on all players, but you can maybe limit risk. And if you see a player is going to be 10% owned and you have 50%, you can maybe lower them to 30%. You're still way overweight on the field, and you're kind of limiting that risk so that you don't kill your bankroll for the rest of the season. Because even though you want to play like the most highest EV lineups, you still want to make sure that your bankroll can last the whole season. And there still is variance in DFS, even with NBA, which is a relatively low variance sport. So for me, that's a way that I add value. It's just kind of managing risk, looking at my exposure versus the ownership projection, and just making sure that I'm not opening myself up to too bad of a day from having too much ownership in one player. But again, it depends on how much of your bankroll you're playing, which contest you're playing, all that stuff that Jordan, you talk about every day in office hours, I feel like. So
Yeah, no, I think that's all really good advice. The one thing I'll add on there, and we're planning on doing another strategy session this week about this specifically. If you've watched any of the NBA videos so far this season, you probably know what's coming, and that's late swap. There's a ton of people that even still in 2021 aren't even bothering to do late swap, and the people that aren't really doing it very well. We'll actually be talking about that with Max tomorrow at the same time, a full NBA late swap session. But I think that's another spot. Obviously, SaberSim's still going to handle a lot of the heavy lifting for you pretty automatically there when you go in and swap your lineups. But this is a huge way to get an edge in NBA, especially on nights where there is news breaking. So, but cool. I think this is a good opportunity to jump into some of the questions that have come in through chat, unless you guys have anything else that you wanted to add here. Awesome. Cool. Let's go ahead and just start jumping in. So first question, Paul asked, could you do a full overview of how to use the site and how to make lineups? Paul, we won't have time, unfortunately, in the last 15 minutes or so we have with the other questions to do a breakdown at that level. We have a ton of videos on our YouTube channel here that dive into sport specific breakdowns here of how to use the tool for each individual sport and how to do different things. Also, if you're not already in Slack, I highly recommend joining Slack. The description of every past office hours video has a link. You can also always email us, support@sabersim.com, and we can get you a link to join our Slack community, and you can ask any questions that you have about how to use the tools, specific functionality, anything like that. I'd be happy to help. I'm sure Matt and Will would be happy to help. There's also a ton of very savvy users in our Slack community that would be happy to help there as well. So I'm going to jump to this next question, though. Aaron asked, for FanDuel NBA, is it better to go by projected score or SaberScore? And maybe before we answer this question, Matt, can you maybe provide a little bit of a background, too, of just what SaberScore is? It's a kind of unique to our process.
Yeah, so SaberScore is essentially our way of incorporating ownership, correlation, and ranges of outcomes into kind of our rating of the lineup. So it's also looking at just the projection as well. So the projection score is literally just the sum of the projection of the lineup. SaberScore accounts for ownership and correlation and upside kind of relative to your slider settings as well. So if you have a really high ownership fade and really high correlation slider, that'll be kind of incorporated into SaberScore. I mean, NBA is the one sport where like you can use proj score and get away with it, and probably like still have good lineups. I'll even admit, like in past years, I've done that sometimes where I've wanted to use proj score mostly as a way to kind of ensure that I'm still getting like high projected line. Like I might use a maximum sim variance and then sort by proj score just so I can make sure that like, hey, I'm utilizing these sims, but I'm still kind of getting like high overall projected lineups that might have a higher mean than like the SaberScore ones. So I think that's valid depending on your slider settings, but I would still use SaberScore in NBA because, like we've been saying for this whole video, correlation and ownership and upside matter. So I think SaberScore is just going to, it's just going to account for that in your lineups more than ProjScore would. But again, using ProjScore, you're still sorting in the lineup build that is created using those sims. So it's not like you're just getting the top projected optimal lineups that don't account for the sims when you're using ProjScore. So it's not the worst thing. You're still getting high quality, probably plus EV lineups. Personally, I would use SaberScore though, but I think it's probably a personal decision.
Just to piggyback on that real quick, I know what also this sort of ties in when you talked about risk mitigation and controlling exposures is sometimes, if I'm running my sliders a bit higher than what I normally would, if I just want to take a look at it that way, and I like the look of them, but I'm a little uncomfortable with like sort of how edgy the lineups are, if you'll go with that, I'll definitely, if I'm using higher than normal sliders sort by projected score for that exact reason is it's sorting within the same pool of lineups to begin with, but you making sure that you're still getting high quality lineups at the top.
Gotcha. Yeah, well said. And one thing that I see is a bit of a common point of confusion here is no matter how you sort your lineups, projected score or SaberScore, we're not rebuilding lineups at that point. It's merely a sorting method of your pool of 500 or 1,500 lineups that we always say are viable for the contest you're playing. So I don't think this is a place where you can go necessarily wrong or go very wrong and enter bad lineups. It's really the way I like to think about it is by sorting with projected score. Your lineups probably have a little bit higher min cash equity at the expense of some upside, whereas maybe by SaberScore you have a little bit of additional upside in those lineups. So but really good question there. Another question from Paul here, and I'll handle this one real quick. He said, I'd love to know when you make the lineups and it says to change two things to view. I always just change the projections by a fraction, but how much should you up or lower the projection? That is a DraftKings community guideline. You guys need to make two changes to projections, ownership, I think, or exposures pre or post build to unlock the lineups to make sure that we're abiding by DraftKings integrity rules. So, if that is working for you, Paul, I think that works fine. The way I often actually end up doing that is taking the opportunity to make two adjustments to exposures in step 3, which allows me to do some of the risk management things that Matt was talking about before. But I think this is really just a good opportunity to make two small tweaks that allow you to leave your mark on your lineups overall. There was a comment here, and I don't know about what this is, and maybe this is an inside joke, but Dexter said not hearing enough about the PPMCC. Very disappointed. Maybe this is an inside joke. I don't know if you guys have any idea what Dexter's saying. He followed that up by saying, "JK, love you guys." So
I'm not sure. I feel like I should know, but I don't.
We'll keep it rolling then. But we love you too, Dexter. Aaron asked, and there was actually 2 users that asked a very similar question here. Aaron and Kenneth both asked about kind of core plays for NBA. Aaron said, when building my lineups for NBA, do you think I'll get good lineups if I have a core of 3 to 4 players? Do you think SaberSim will still build high quality lineups? And then Kenneth asked, making GPP lines, should I use a core of players for NBA? How many guys, 3 or 4? And I think I expect this to be a common question as we jump into NBA season, because I think in particular NBA lends itself well to other content creators establishing core plays and putting out their 3 to 4 locks of the slate. What do you guys think about this strategy overall for NBA and doing this with SaberSim?
So, I mean, I know, Jordan, you talk about this on office hours of like kind of running research builds.
Yeah.
First, I would definitely start with that before like locking in any core plays, just to see like what is just the naked research build going to give you in terms of players, and you might see that there's 3 or 4 guys at the top that SaberSim really recommends, and you can kind of like use that as your core. I mean, it's not a strategy that I do. I'd say like if you're going to lock in 3 or 4 players, you should be pretty conservative with your bankroll management, because you're probably going to have a higher variance in your results. If 1 or 2 of those players has a bad game, you might not cash anything. But if you find that that's like an easier way to kind of think about a slate, I don't think it's terrible. I think you're just losing a bit of the nuance of, you might have 3 or 4 players that are all good plays, but one of them is a better play. But if you have 100% of all of them, then you're not really capturing that difference. Whereas maybe you want to have 80% of one and 60% of the other, and that'll kind of better, measure their actual, leverage and value. So,
yeah, for me,
I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't go into it with a core in mind. I think I often, after I finish building and tweaking my exposures, I usually do end up with like 3 or 4 main guys that are like my highest exposures, and then sort of the rest of the lineups are lower, like 25% players that all just sort of get mixed and matched around that core. So I don't usually like sort of pick my players beforehand or go in with one in mind. But I do think that like that's a pretty common MME thing. There's usually like whether it be like the chalky guy, like somebody who was priced at 4K but getting a ton more minutes. There's definitely like good reason to have like studs that you've built around. But I usually I guess I wouldn't be restrictive about it going in. I would sort of, if you really want somebody, bump their projection and see where they come out with. That's just my personal take on it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree there. And I think the last thing I'll add is that this is obviously very contest specific as well. If you run a build of maybe a 20 lineups on the right slate, you might end up seeing that you're having a few players locked in. If you're running 3 lineups, you're almost certainly going to see this core of a few guys that are showing up in all your lineups. If you're building 150, you probably won't. And that's kind of indicative of, I think, Matt, you touched on this, but how much additional risk you're taking on by locking in those players in more and more lineups and also more and more bankroll. So that's the question. Like, this is a riskier approach, I think. If you're playing conservatively with your bankroll and you're only playing a few lineups, maybe it's a good way to go. If you're playing more bankroll and you're playing 150 lineups, you're pretty over, well, maybe not over, but you're pretty well exposed to those core plays. So just be careful with that. I think that the test build of plugging in your sliders for the contest you're playing and seeing what kind of exposures you are getting is a great way to start here before you just go in and lock any players in for your lineup. So did have some kind words from Bob here. Said, I've chatted with Will regarding his CSGO process numerous times, and I had to say he's a certified genius. Everything you've implemented in NBA is not even close to being done across the industry. It gives more great confidence in your new product and can't wait to see the results. Thank you, Bob.
I don't think I deserve that, but thank you.
We did get one other question here from Clay. Actually, we have a few more questions here. We touched on this question here at the start, but maybe kind of glossed over it a little bit quickly as we were just getting going. So Clay, if you missed the start of the show, definitely recommend going back and watching this again. But maybe one more time, we can give kind of the quick answer to this question, because again, I think this is crucial, and what users are seeing when they see a projection 51.02 points for Nikola Jokic tonight is very different than what you're getting elsewhere around the industry.
Yeah, so I'll do the quick elevator pitch. We simulate each game thousands of times, play by play, and so when Jokic has a projection of 52, that is the average of his thousands of simulated results. So some of them he's going to be 40, some of them he's going to have 80 points, some he'll have 55 points. That is just the average of that full distribution of results from this simulator.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's perfect. And again, we did dive in a little bit more in detail earlier at the start of this stream, so definitely recommend checking that out if you still have some more questions for us. There was a question here also from a Jordan. So he said, how do you determine good chalk versus bad chalk? And I think maybe an interesting way to approach this here is to talk about our ownership fade slider, because I think this is a bit of a unique approach to the way that we handle ownership, and maybe a little bit different than what most people are used to. Do you guys want to talk about what this ownership fade slider is actually doing when it builds your lineups?
Yeah, so we're ownership fade is essentially just adjusting the as we're building the lineups, we're adjusting which players we are putting into the lineup based on their ownership projection compared to their projection in the builder. And just to be clear, that usually doesn't mean the mean projection. It means the projection from this sim, this bucket of sims based on the sim variance slider. So if you have a very high sim variance, then the ownership fade is going to apply to each of those simulation results, or bucket of a few simulation results. And it also does account for the kind of overall standard deviation of the player projection. So a player that has a higher variance in their sim results is going to be a chalky player like that is going to be punished more by ownership fade, and a low owned player is going to get boosted more, because essentially, if there's a guy that's going to be 60% owned but has a high probability of kind of having a dud game, you want to fade that player more, have less of them, than if it's a player that's going to be 60% owned but they're almost guaranteed to hit value. And so the ownership fade slider does account for that discrepancy of like, given the same ownership projection and the same mean projection, it might do different things to different players based on like their variance in in the sims. So I do want to point that out, but kind of getting to determining good chalk versus bad chalk is the ownership fade slider sort of does that for you. Is it, and you might want to adjust the ownership projections if you think somebody's going to be higher owned than we do. Absolutely adjust it and see how that affects your exposures at the end of the day, or bump up that ownership fade slider and see how that affects things. You're still like, even with a high ownership fade, you're still going to get chalky players if they're really highly projected and they're just a good play kind of no matter how they do. Whereas other players that are chalky, you're gonna not. So that's kind of the way to know what's good chalk or bad chalk. It's like, use that ownership fade slider, run builds and see what you get, and look at like your exposure versus their ownership, and kind of research it that way.
Yeah, and you mentioned, so it's taking into account the variance of the player. And in baseball, obviously hitters are much higher variance than pitchers. That chalk is often worse. Defenses in football are very high variance positions. Chalky defenses are a lot of times going to be faded. Do you guys know, I'm curious, are there any similar trends in basketball, either by position or by salary, where there is like a typical higher variance kind of player?
I think an interesting one is, I know we've touched on it before, but like a new starter, where there's just unknowns, not only how long they're going to play, but also what does their usage look like when they're on the court with other, heavy shooters. And so I think that can sort of be a thing where most projection systems are going to bump their average projection up quite a bit because now they're starting and they have the same salary as they did when they were expected to be coming off the bench. So they can be chalky, but they also do carry a higher variance just because there's more unknowns in how they'll play and how much they'll play. That you can sort of see fading that chalk is a bit more palatable than, say, fading a Giannis chalk day because he's Giannis.
Yeah, I would also, I think on the other side of that is bench players can also be high variance because they're not guaranteed to get minutes. And I think someone actually mentioned it in the comments, Bruce Brown yesterday was very highly projected by us and a lot of other sources, but he was not a starter, I don't think. And he got very little playing time because he just wasn't really, it's the first game of the season. No one really knows what the rotations are going to look like, and he just didn't get much run. And that's kind of a high variance play. Again, I mentioned it earlier, like Avery Bradley, or rookies that are on the bench where you don't really know how the coaches are going to play them. And I would say, especially early in the season, the first few games of the season for these teams, like no one really knows exactly how many minutes each player is going to play, and there's going to be a lot more variance than or at least a lot more uncertainty than later in the season. So if you see someone projected to be chalk and they're not starting, they're they're on a team that maybe a new team, or they're a rookie, that might be a good spot to if ownership fade doesn't do it for you, because we're not even going to get their variance right exactly. We've done a lot of work on that, but if they're a rookie, we don't necessarily know what that variance is going to look like. You might want to be more aggressive with like setting an exposure cap or limiting their ownership, because there's like a higher probability that they might not get the minutes that they're projected for. So that's where, again, when we were talking about adding value, that's one way to do it, is look for those players where there's more uncertainty in either their minutes projection or like their usage projection, and kind of adjust that way.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And it's kind of a subtle difference, but I think, rather than sitting here and looking at the players' projections and comparing to ownership and trying to make a decision on, are these plays good chalk yourself, study the ownership projections themselves. People are generally pretty well equipped to predict what other people are going to do. Make your adjustments to the ownership projections, and then maybe tick the ownership fade slider up a notch, and to let the computer determine what the good chalk and the bad chalk is, adding your value to the ownership projections. That's something that I do a ton. That is actually like very similar to what my process ends up looking like, where I think I can add more value rather than trying to make the decisions on whether or not the chalk is good myself. I'll figure out what the chalk is or add a little bit of additional value to the ownership projections, and then let the model or let the builder decide where the chalk is or where the good chalk is. Don followed this up. He said, Jordan mentioned something yesterday about determining good versus bad chalk by looking at the player correlations. Wanted to ask what he was talking about. Don, honestly, I don't really remember talking about that. It sounds like I probably misspoke and said something incorrect. Matt, Will, is there anything that this is maybe making you kind of think that I
first saw it,
maybe more. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just, when I first saw it, I was thinking like, they have a chalk player, but instead of playing the chalk player, you play someone correlated with them. Or if you are going to play the chalk player, you play someone they're correlated with but lower owned. Maybe that is a way to sort of bring down the overall ownership of like similar lineups you're competing with, while still, getting exposed to the chalky person for whatever reason they are chalk. But I'm not sure what you meant.
Yeah, I mean, it also might just be what they're talking about is the distribution graph rather than the correlation. So if you look at the distribution graph for a player and they have a high, range of outcomes and they're chalk, and this is kind of what I was just talking about. So, Jokic might have a tighter distribution versus someone that has like a smaller number of minutes that's playing off the bench. And, if they're chalk, but they're, they have a 40% chance or a 30% chance of getting under 15 points, then maybe that's a good way to determine bad chalk. I mean, the builder will sort of do that for you, but if you want to do some more research and like dig into those distribution graphs, that I think that's an interesting thing to look at for sure.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I mean, one other thing that I do, and I've mentioned this before when talking about NFL, is sometimes if I am taking a stand on a slate overall and maybe fading or going underweight on a certain player that's chalky, I will increase my exposure to players that are negatively correlated to that player. Like a very common example is that when I inevitably fade Derrick Henry every week in NFL and that ends up burning me, I might end up playing more AJ Brown, a player that has a small negative correlation to Henry or something like that. I know I've talked about that recently, Don, so it's possible that was coming up too.
Yeah, and a good example there is like the Lakers this year. They have three studs. Obviously, with LeBron, Anthony Davis, and Westbrook, it's very unlikely that all three are going to have like ceiling performances. If one of them is projected to be higher owned, maybe you want to fade that player and bump up one of the other two, or both of the other two, because if Westbrook has a bad game, LeBron might have a better game, or vice versa. So that's kind of a similar type of adjustment to your Derrick Henry example.
Right. Yeah. A little more NBA relevant too.
Yeah.
That was the first thing that popped in my mind, but we'll keep rolling. We've got a few more questions here. We'll get through as many of these as we can here. Jeffrey said, I like to lock in a core of 3 to 4 players for cash purposes and dwindle my player pool down to my final lineup. Why does SaberSim continually ask to expand the player pool? New to SaberSim for informational purposes. The reason you're getting a message that's saying you need to expand your player pool is the restrictions you've put on the lineups here by dwindling down or maybe locking players in or setting max exposures to 0. We don't have enough lineups in the pool to come up with a lineup that fits all of those restrictions. I think this process actually is pretty sound for cash overall, as long as you're making sharp locks. One thing I would recommend that I think would probably immediately alleviate this is just build more lineups. Down here, if you set your style to cash, all your sliders are going to go to 0. A lot of times I think, and obviously what makes a ton of intuitive sense is people will go in and just press their one cash lineup they need, and the pool size maybe will be set to 20 or something like that. If you build yourself a big, much larger pool of lineups that we can look through, you could even go as high as 1,500 here. That might be a little bit too high for cash. You'll have a lot more lineups to play with, and you're less likely to see that message. Anything that you guys wanted to add there?
I mean, I would say if you're trying to like dwindle down your player pool significantly, like do that before you run the build rather than after, like kind of manage those players. If there's players that you don't want in your pool, exclude them before you run a build, because then like all of the lineups in your pool won't have that player, rather than like maybe only a handful don't have them. So, um, I know some people like to just like uncheck everyone and just like add players individually. It sounds like a lot of work to me, but you could also like set a higher min projection with those player pool filters, or maybe just upload projections for just the players you want, something like that.
Yeah, and on that note too, I mean, just be cautious. We actually just did a strategy session yesterday on NBA cash game strategy, and I mean, the only thing that I would be a little bit concerned about here is if you are going far beyond the first 20 or even 40 cash optimals that our model is coming up with. You're sacrificing a lot of raw projected points, which are pretty important in cash. I mean, if you think the projections are off or think there's value to be added by improving them there, then great. But just be careful, playing the 100th optimal that shows up when you run a cash lineup, because there's typically a big difference in projected points between that and the top overall lineup. So Kenneth has a really good question here as well. And this is a common topic, is after completing step 3 or in step 3, is it smart to sort by 85th percentile and enter those lineups? What are your thoughts on percentiles overall and the best use for those, especially in NBA?
Yeah, real quick, I'm about to have to jump off, but I really like that idea, honestly. Maybe not for finalizing, like they're picking the end lineups, but I really like to look at it and then see how the exposures change when ranking lineups in that manner. Because you can sort of, especially if you've taken more conservative slider settings, if you've selected the 85th or 95th percentile, or you can sort of get a better feeling about which of those players and lineups are higher upside. And sort of bump, those players accordingly when you go back down. I think submitting the lineups at the 85th percentile gets a little bit dangerous, because it's not the 85th percentile of the lineup as a whole. It's the 85th percentile of the players within the lineup. And so you do lose some of like the interconnectedness that you get from sim variance in that way. Or at least that's my understanding of it. And Matt, I'll pass it to you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a bunch, Will.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, I change percentile pretty often, honestly. I like to, I mean, not all the time. I'd say less in NBA, just because I don't think you're going to see that big of a difference. Because like we said, a lot of those distributions are fairly normal looking. And so 85th percent, there's not going to be as many differences between those 85th percentile versus average as there would be in MLB, where like pitchers are going to have way different kind of like distribution shapes than batters. But I'll often do that just to, prioritize the players with the higher ceiling a little bit more. Just be careful if you're doing that while also making like custom projection adjustments, because things can get wonky if like you adjust the average projection for a player, but then you change the rest of the players to 85th, then you just need to be a little bit careful with how that is interacting. But it's definitely not a bad idea.
Any thoughts? Another common follow-up I get in office hours is like, any thoughts on the value or the reason why you might pick 85th versus 95th versus 75th versus 99th, or anything to be concerned of specifically with any of those?
I mean, when you get to like 99th, that's a very low probability. Like, there's just probably a little bit more variance. Those are outcomes that are happening only 1% of the time in the sims. So there's a little bit more variance, and it's not really something you don't need all of your players to hit their 99th percentile outcome. I mean, you don't need all of them to hit their 85th either. But when you get to 99th, like, you don't want your lineup to be full of really high variance players.
Yeah.
Again, for NBA, it doesn't matter as much because the variance there's lower variance in variance, but you just want to be careful of like not being too risky with your lineups. But honestly, like, my guess is that you won't see very major changes in your exposures when you go from average to 75th to 85th to 95th to 99th. For NBA specifically, you definitely will for MLB, and you very likely will for NFL. But for NBA, I think it'll be more, minor changes.
Gotcha. Cool. Question from Mitchell here. He said, if I'm entering a build 30 minutes before lock in NBA, is it okay to just refresh after that? My personal take on this here is that, especially if there is a new starting lineup that comes out, new sims that have run, news that is broken overall, it is ultimately always going to be best to start with a brand new build instead of just refreshing your projections of that build. That said, my overall, the thing I always say on office hours is the most negative EV thing you can do is miss lock. So at the very least, make sure that you have lineups that were generated at least within the maybe 30 minutes to an hour before the slate locking that are in. So at least you have the opportunity to late swap later if you need to. And then secondarily to that, if a starting lineup comes out 5 minutes before lock and you don't have time to run a build and do the things that you want to that build to get your lineups where they need to be, then just refresh the build you already have, refresh the projections, and put those lineups in that have been a little bit more dialed in, whether that is for risk management or whatever. I don't think it's always perfectly cut and dry. If there was a huge player that got scratched that was playing in the games that started at lock, I would probably be trying to do everything I could to get a brand new build run. But NBA is tough for that reason. The news breaks all the time and inconsistently. Yeah. It's not always easy to know.
Yeah, I mean, we've tried to make the build process as fast as we can, but yeah, totally. Like, if you have a build ready and it's 5 minutes before lock and some news comes out, you might want to just adjust exposures, just like uncheck that player. Especially if it's someone you have like a very high exposure to, then you probably should rebuild. If it's someone where it's like, oh, you have 2% of some guy that just got scratched, just like maybe uncheck them. If it's going to bump up another player on the team, maybe set a min exposure for that player if you don't feel like you have enough time to run a new build. Or maybe do that first, enter those lineups, and then see if you have time to run a full new build. Like, sometimes it's best to like just use quick swap and get the player out, upload those lineups, and then just try to do another build. And if you can't, then you can't. But at least you've like done the important, like the 90% or 95% of it is like get the injured player out of your lineups or get the 3K starter in some lineups. So yeah.
Denise said, is there a quick way to eliminate players from the pool instead of clicking every check mark? One of the most useful ways that you can do this is this new filter option, which will at the very least kind of let you make bulk and blunt changes. I actually use this pretty often. I like for NBA. Typically we have a default here that's set to eliminate any players projected under 15 average points. A lot of times I will bump this up. So maybe I'm interested in bumping this up to 18 for a slate, and you click apply and it will automatically remove everybody from the pool 18 or less than 18. That's pretty useful here. I know that if you're trying to get a little bit more granular here, the check marking I think is the best way to go. All of these columns are sortable, so I know something I've seen other people do before, not necessarily commenting on the strategy behind these things, but sorting by minutes, and you can maybe remove some very particularly low projected minutes players, sorting by percentiles if you wanted to remove players maybe with a very low floor if you're playing cash, or players with limited upside for your GPPs. At that point,
you could also
oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say you could use CSV upload if you want to kind of manage that in yourself, like in a spreadsheet. Like, download the player pool and just like delete the players that you don't want that way, and then just upload only the players that you want in your pool, and you check that box that says like remove players not projected, not included. That would be obviously then you kind of have to do stuff in Excel or whatever, but that's another way if you want a quicker way of like if you really just want a tiny pool and you don't want to like uncheck individually, that's probably what I would do is kind of download and manage, things that way and then just re-upload it. But
yeah, and last note on this question too, I'll say is that, on a traditional optimizer, a lot of times you have to do a ton of player pool curation before your build, just so you're not getting like a ton of random scrubs in your lineups. We're not going to build lineups just by default with players that don't have upside for all the reasons we've talked about this entire stream, right? We're pulling players from individual game sims or small buckets of game sims and building these lineups around those players. So, another approach here, and this would be obviously very hands-off, is to just leave it alone and see what you get, and then manage your player pool in step 3 by removing maybe a few of those low-end guys that happen to sneak in that you don't want to play, rather than spending a ton of time. There's already 358 players that have been removed from the pool. There's probably well over a few hundred players in the player pool tonight. You don't need to meticulously go through the entire player pool here. Few quick questions here. Aaron said, can you show how to expand the bar graph again, please? If you just click on any player here, it'll pull up that player's range of outcomes and along with their correlation data for any other player playing in that game. So pretty straightforward there. Aaron also asked for top value plays. What price do you guys usually suggest? Under 6,500 or 4K to 6,500? Again, I think there's a lot of content out there that kind of targets these rule of thumbs of like, certain play a guy in this salary range in every lineup, or play 2 guys in this salary range in every lineup. And those kinds of rules of thumbs lack a lot of nuance for slate specific questions and contest specific questions. And one of the big advantages of SaberSim is that we can deal with the questions of what different slate sizes look like, what different slate textures in general look like, and also what different contest types look like. If you're curious what our top plays are in a given price range or for a given team or a given position on any given slate, the best advice I can always offer is go in here, go to step 2, set the contest you're playing, and build some lineups. And my legitimate answer to this question for this particular slate would be running this test build and then going and looking at what kind of plays, what exposures am I getting to different plays in these salary ranges. Anything you wanted to add on there?
Not really. Honestly, I don't really, look at price and value too much. Or at least I don't really care about having like a certain number of players under a certain value. I think,
right.
Let the builder do that work for you and kind of add value in a different, in other ways rather than like kind of trying to get these rules of thumb. But that's just me.
Yeah, no, I'm totally the same way. And just so happens that on this particular slate, there's a lot of value at the 4K range. So best way to identify that and to see that is just by running those test builds. That's all the questions we had in YouTube here. I'm going to go ahead and we'll hit these questions that have come in from Slack. First of all, thank you guys, everybody, so much for asking all these questions. I know there's a lot of excitement about NBA this season. Question from Rick here in Slack, and he said, will there ever be a way to go through my generated lineups and click on my favorites that puts them into a separate pool or build that can be uploaded? It's just extremely difficult to adjust exposures to dial in the exact sets of lines that I'd like to play. Would love to click on a certain player or stack, peruse those lineups, and then select the ones I like the most. And Rick, the good news is that you can really do a lot of this here already. One of my favorite ways that I like to do this is to actually pivot over to the pool here. So there's a different tab here. Pool is going to show you all of your individual lineups, even those that aren't in your top pool of 20 here. And then you could pick individual player combinations. So let's say that you had decided that on tonight's slate, you wanted to find some lineups that have Karl Anthony Towns and maybe Damian Lillard together. So obviously here, we're getting a message here that says you need to expand to match exposures, but we should be able to go through here. It's actually a little bit strange that we're getting this mix and matching here. But you can go through and actually, this actually didn't have the effect I
would use the player filter rather than locking.
Oh, I locked. That's my mistake. Yeah. No, that's what I actually intended to do here. Okay, yeah. So filter, sorry. Press this plus magnifying glass icon here, and that will filter lineups by these combinations of players. And when you're looking at your pool, you can do this even if we're showing 0 exposure for your top 20 here. So we just don't have any of that particular combination here, but maybe we'll pick something a little easier, right? And if we wanted to go through and identify combinations that include Towns and Dinwiddie here, we can then check these lineups in, and that will become that will go into our pool. So you're seeing now that these are 22 lineups.
And you could like start with one lineup or 0 lineups, and then literally just like check the lineups that you want, and then download at the end of it.
Absolutely.
So that seems like exactly what Rick is trying to get. It's like start with nothing and then just look at the different player combinations, check ones you want.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you could legitimately.
There might be issues. I don't know if we're set up to do 0 or not. Maybe
I don't think so. But maybe just one lineup here and then go through your pool and pick them out. So that's how I'd recommend doing that. Let's see. CP Hustler asked a very similar question here. I'll read this aloud, but I think we just answered a question very similar to this. But he said, shortly before lock, I've made all my adjustments and have my builds sitting there ready to go. News breaks, new sims generated. When those sims are uploaded and data is adjusted, will my builds automatically incorporate those adjustments, or do I need to rerun those builds to have sim adjustments incorporated? So, it is worth noting here, let's expand this back up to 20, that you can press this refresh button up here. And I actually think this will automatically refresh if you come back to this particular URL. But we will update all of the projections based on our most recent sims. And that's a very good way to just like make quick adjustments when new sims run. But in general, I would say if new sims are running, and especially if news has broken or if there's a new starting lineup that has come out, if you can identify that significant news has come out, it's probably a good idea to rebuild. But we talked about that in a little bit more detail a couple minutes ago. Hopefully, CP Hustler, you saw that here. If not, I'd recommend checking out the recording of this video here. A few more questions here, and then we'll go ahead and start to wrap this up. B Crimson 10 asked, well, first of all, he said, thanks so much for these videos. Appreciate all the work you guys do. And then said, how do you guys project the rookies this season?
Yeah, rookies are tough for NBA, especially because there's not, for MLB, generally the rookies will have like years of minor league data, and NBA, there's not as much of that, or sometimes, there's none. So it's tough. We do look at props and Vegas stuff as not just like exactly taking that 100%, but we'll use that as sort of like guide rails in terms of like if we're projecting a rookie that's way off of where the props are at, we'll kind of have a warning flag there that says like, hey, maybe we should look at this player and adjust them. And we'll look at other data as well, but generally for NBA, like we're accounting for recent results very quickly because there's much less noise. So after a few games of that the rookie has under their belt, that's going to be pretty highly weighted in their projections. So I would say like definitely the first few games like that, like I said before, that's a way to add value. Is if you think that the rookie, if you think we're like under projecting their rebounds or assists or something, you can bump them up because you saw them play in college, or that they're a really good play. But at the end of the day, like it's kind of just very hard to project NBA rookies because no one really knows how they're going to play because there's not really much data on them. Not just like their performance, but also their like playing time and usage. So we do our best with the data that we have in terms of like creating accurate models, but there's definitely more uncertainty there. So I would, if that's something that you like to do, you feel like a lot about NBA rookies and you want to add value there, I'm certain that you can, add some value by just adjusting projections for guys that you think that are a little bit off.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll add there too is, the way that we are accounting for context in these games, I think can give us another advantage over a a traditional tool or somebody just creating projections in a spreadsheet or something like that. Like, two rookies that maybe are the same salary and have a similar player type, right? By the fact that we know that rookie 1 is playing with 3 guys that put up a ton of shots, we'll be able to contextually understand that that player is just going to have less overall opportunities there than the other guy, right? Or same deal, because we're thinking about game scripts, a team that's really bad, that has a high usage rookie on the team that maybe is going to get an opportunity late in games because of the way that these game scripts are going to play out, to just chuck it, right? We might be able to project these guys a little bit better, just given the game scripts and given the context of the team they're playing on, that maybe squeezes out a little bit of additional edge there too. So we'll go ahead here and hit this last question here. And let's see. This was also from CP Hustler, and he said, any chance we could get the ability to make the manual adjustments to lineups? So many times I just want to make one player adjustment or create an additional correlation in 1 or 2 lineups. Adjusting exposures is not targeted enough for just one particular lineup. I need to be able to easily make just 1 or 2 swaps. And Matt, I think we've actually at least explored this a little bit here.
That is on the roadmap for sure.
Awesome.
Yep. We will be adding that, or at least we had been planning on. I think it's been pretty crazy with NFL and then NBA starting. We've been really focused on that. But in terms of like UI improvements, new features, that's definitely near the top of the list. Is that ability to just swap out individual players from lineups, basically like you can do on DraftKings or FanDuel itself. In the meantime, I would, you can probably just do it on draft, upload your lineups and then make those changes on DraftKings, or you can use quick swap, but again, that's for all of your lineups. But yeah, that is definitely on the roadmap. Yeah.
Sweet. Last one here. This just came in from Zoe on YouTube. He said, will projections be loaded in for rookies like Giddey, Duarte? I would say maybe what might be a more interesting answer here, especially in a sport like NBA, where lineups are going to come out through the day and then a bunch are going to come out closer to lock. We'll look into these 2 particular players and make sure that we've got them projected if they're going to play. But Matt, do you want to maybe provide a little bit of a background of what people can expect with how often Sims will update when we hear that people are going to play, or when people maybe should expect to see updated player news, especially as we're approaching lock, right? We're 3.5 hours away now. Obviously that's going to get a little bit more tighter as we get closer to lock.
Yeah. So we run Sims throughout the day. If you look in the NBA alerts channel, like we're kind of running for NBA, it's very different than other sports where we're just like taking all this information and like running a lot of Sims, just based on like even just small changes to minutes and rosters and stuff, because it's the beginning of the season and things just change a lot. There's a lot of unknowns. For like these particular players, we'll look into it. To be frank, like we sometimes miss players, like if there's rookies and we are matching them up to the wrong player in the database or something like that, like we'll look into that and make sure that guys that are expected to get minutes, that are rookies, are getting minutes. If these are issues, or maybe we're just not projecting them to be in the rotation. But we do run Sims throughout the day, and then especially like as starting lineups are released and as injury news comes out, we'll be running Sims that update for that as well.
Awesome. Cool. Well, last thing here before we jump off, I will just remind everybody, I mentioned this yesterday as well, but we have reset everybody's trial here for the start of NBA. So if you have checked us out in the past and left, I would recommend coming back, giving us another try for this NBA season. As Matt and Will have been mentioning here, we've made a ton of improvements for this year. We're all super excited for the start of NBA. If you are really just here for NBA and haven't been playing for baseball or for football, you probably saw during the course of the stream that the app looks quite a bit different. We pushed out a full visual update a couple months ago now that also came with a host of a whole bunch of new features. So free 7 days, no strings attached. Even if you've tried us here, look, there's even a message here popping up now. Even if you've tried us here before in the past, come back, sign back up, get a free 7 days. You can play NBA tonight all week, play Thursday night football tomorrow, play Sunday, NFL, and just getting a whole opportunity to try this out and try out the Sims for a whole week. So that is all we've got. Before we jump off, Matt, anything else that you wanted to touch on here?
No, I feel like we hit a lot.
Yeah, we sure did. Thank
All
you guys,
good.
everybody that asked questions. The best streams here are the ones where we always have a bunch of questions and engagement from you guys. We'll be right back again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, me and Max talking a little bit of NBA late swap strategy. Matt, thanks again for jumping on here, and good luck this NBA season.
Thanks, Jordan.